The conference room felt smaller than usual, despite the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Austin. I sat perfectly still as David Thompson adjusted his tie and cleared his throat, his eyes avoiding mine completely. The email he'd sent an hour earlier had been brief. "Jessica, please see me at 3 p.m. Bring transition notes for your current projects." I knew what was coming before I even knocked on his door. "Jessica, we need to discuss some organizational changes," he began, shuffling papers that clearly contained my professional obituary. "Given your upcoming situation, we think it's best to redistribute some of your responsibilities. Tyler will be stepping up to handle the TechFlow account and the Verde campaign launch." I felt the flutter in my stomach that had nothing to do with morning sickness. 7 years I'd poured into this company. 7 years of 60-hour weeks, skipped vacations, and campaigns that put Pinnacle Marketing Solutions on the map in Austin's competitive advertising scene. Now 3 months pregnant with my first child, I was watching my career get handed to a 26-year-old who still asked me how to format PowerPoint presentations. "I see," I said, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. "And what exactly will my new responsibilities include?" David's smile was the kind you give a child who's asked an adorable but naive question. "We're creating a new role for you, Strategic Planning Coordinator. You'll focus on research and documentation, less client-facing work. We know how important it is for you to avoid stress right now." The irony wasn't lost on me. Nothing had been more stressful than this conversation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Jessica Martinez, and until that February afternoon in 2024, I thought I had it all figured out. I was the senior marketing manager at Pinnacle Marketing Solutions, pulling down 6 figures in a city where breakfast tacos cost $8, and everyone has a startup idea. I had the corner office, the respect of my team, and a track record that spoke for itself. I also had something else that apparently made me a liability in David Thompson's eyes. A growing baby, and the audacity to think I could handle both motherhood and a demanding career. What David didn't know, as he sat there explaining how my demotion was actually a gift wrapped in corporate speak, was that I'd already started building something he couldn't take away from me. While he was busy protecting his precious boys' club from the inconvenience of a pregnant woman, I'd been quietly laying the groundwork for the most strategic career move of my life. A move that would transform his moment of dismissing me into the very thing that elevated me past him entirely. This is the story of how David Thompson thought pregnancy would derail my ambitions, and how I used his own prejudice to fuel the engine that would eventually drive him right out of his job. When I first walked into Pinnacle Marketing Solutions in September 2017, Austin was still pretending to be weird while rapidly becoming expensive. The company occupied 2 floors of a sleek downtown building, all exposed brick and reclaimed wood, the kind of place that served kombucha on tap and had a slide between floors that no one over 30 ever used. I was 25, fresh from my MBA at UT, and hungry in the way that only comes from growing up watching your parents clean office buildings at night so you could have textbooks during the day. David Thompson was already the regional director then, a man who'd climbed the corporate ladder during the era when FaceTime mattered more than actual results. He had the kind of confidence that comes from never being told no, never having to prove himself twice, never walking into a room and wondering if people saw his qualifications or just his demographics. During my interview, he'd spent more time talking about the company's beer fridge than my portfolio, but I'd gotten the job anyway. I was good at what I did, and even David's blind spots couldn't completely obscure that. The early years flew by in a blur of campaign launches, client presentations, and late nights fueled by optimism and overpriced coffee. I started as a marketing specialist, but within 18 months I was managing the Verde lifestyle account, an eco-friendly product line that was struggling to find its voice in the sustainable living space. I didn't just find their voice, I amplified it into a symphony. The campaign I developed increased their quarterly sales by 68%, and won Pinnacle its first Austin Business Journal Marketing Excellence Award. David took credit for mentoring the project, but everyone who mattered knew the truth. Pat Chen, the the VP of Operations, started pulling me into strategy meetings. Amanda Foster, the CEO of TechFlow Industries, specifically requested me for their account. Sarah Kim, my assistant, watched me field calls from competitors trying to poach me. I was building something real, something lasting, something that felt like the American dream my parents had carried across borders and through night shifts. By 2022, I was the senior marketing manager with 12 people reporting to me and a budget that would have fed my family for a decade when I was growing up. I managed 3 major accounts, developed the company's first successful influencer marketing program, and consistently delivered results that kept David's own performance reviews glowing. I wasn't just good at my job, I was essential to the department's success, and everyone knew it. Everyone except David, apparently, who seemed to view my achievements as lucky accidents rather than earned victories. The first crack in the facade appeared during my annual review in January. David had given me the standard exceeds expectations rating, but his comments were peppered with phrases like, needs to maintain consistency, and quote, could benefit from increased availability. I'd worked more billable hours than anyone else in the department, but somehow my commitment was still in question. When I asked for specifics, he'd waved his hand dismissively and said something about perception being reality in client services. I should have seen it coming. The subtle shift in his tone during meetings, the way he'd started CCing himself on emails between me and my team, the casual comments about how demanding the TechFlow account was becoming. David Thompson was laying groundwork, building a narrative that would justify whatever decision he'd already made about my future. Then Carlos and I found out we were expecting. We'd been trying for over a year, and the positive pregnancy test felt like winning the lottery and climbing Everest simultaneously. Carlos cried. I cried. We called our parents and planned how we'd transform the spare bedroom into a nursery. For exactly 48 hours, I existed in a bubble where the biggest challenge would be figuring out work-life balance, not fighting for my professional survival. I waited until the end of my first trimester to tell David, following all the conventional wisdom about when it's safe to share pregnancy news at work. I scheduled a private meeting, prepared a transition plan for my upcoming maternity leave, and walked into his office with the naive confidence of someone who believed merit and legality would protect her. Congratulations, David had said when I shared the news, but his smile never reached his eyes. That's wonderful. Really wonderful. We'll need to discuss how to handle your workload, of course. Some of these accounts require a lot of travel, a lot of late nights. We want to make sure you're not overextending yourself. The conversation lasted 15 minutes. By the end of it, I knew my career at Pinnacle was about to take a dramatic turn, and not in the direction I'd spent 7 years building toward. That was on a Tuesday. By Friday, the rumors were already circulating. Sarah Kim had heard whispers about restructuring in the marketing department. Pat Chen mentioned that David had been asking about succession planning for client accounts. Amanda Foster sent me a text asking if everything was okay because David had called requesting a meeting to, quote, discuss account management moving forward. I spent that weekend in our Cedar Park home, sitting in what would soon become the nursery, trying to process the reality that my pregnancy had apparently triggered some kind of corporate reorganization designed to minimize my importance. Carlos found me there Sunday evening, laptop open, staring at job listings I wasn't ready to apply for. Maybe it won't be as bad as you think, he said, settling beside me on the floor. Maybe you're reading too much into it. I wanted to believe him. Part of me hoped that David's sudden interest in my stress levels and work-life balance was genuine concern, rather than thinly veiled discrimination. Part of me thought that 7 years of exemplary performance would count for something when push came to shove. I was wrong on both counts. The demotion came exactly 2 weeks after I'd shared my pregnancy news, delivered with the kind of corporate doublespeak that would have been impressive if it wasn't so transparently cruel. David had restructured my role to eliminate client contact, stripped away my team management responsibilities, and reduced my influence to what he generously called strategic documentation. Tyler Brooks, who'd been with the company for exactly 11 months, and whose greatest achievement was successfully ordering lunch for a client meeting, was suddenly the point person for accounts I'd built from the ground up. It's temporary, David assured me as he handed over the transition documents. Just until you get back from maternity leave and we can reassess your bandwidth. We're thinking long-term here, Jessica. This is about protecting your career, not derailing it. The gaslighting was almost artful in its audacity. David Thompson had just demoted me for being pregnant, while simultaneously trying to convince me it was a favor. He'd taken my clients, my team, and my responsibilities, then wrapped the theft in concern for my well-being. It was discrimination so blatant, it would have been laughable if it wasn't happening to me. But here's what David didn't know, what he couldn't have known because he'd never bothered to really see me as anything more than a productivity unit with an inconvenient uterus. I'd been preparing for this moment longer than I'd been preparing for motherhood. Not preparing for discrimination specifically, but preparing for independence. For 3 years, I'd been quietly building relationships, developing skills, and creating opportunities that existed entirely outside of Pinnacle's organizational chart. While David was busy protecting his department from the perceived threat of a pregnant woman, I'd been constructing an empire he didn't even know existed. It started in 2021, during the pandemic, when everyone was working from home and the boundaries between personal projects and professional development became beautifully blurred. I'd begun freelance consulting for small businesses, helping them navigate digital marketing strategies that the big agencies couldn't be bothered with. Nothing that competed with Pinnacle's client base. Nothing that violated my employment agreement, just side work that kept my skills sharp and my network growing. One project led to another. A restaurant owner referred me to his brother, who ran a boutique hotel chain. The hotel owner introduced me to a friend launching a sustainable fashion line. By 2023, I had a quiet but steady stream of consulting work that had earned me nearly $40,000 in additional income and a reputation in Austin's small business community as someone who could deliver results without the overhead of a major agency. More importantly, I developed relationships with vendors, freelancers, and service providers who knew my work independent of my association with Pinnacle. I had a graphic designer who trusted my creative direction, a web developer who could execute my digital strategies, and a copywriter who understood my voice. I'd built a shadow team without realizing I was building a shadow team. The moment David handed me that transition plan, I knew exactly what I was going to do with all those relationships I'd been cultivating. I was going to turn my demotion into his replacement. Tyler Brooks bounded into the office Monday morning like a golden retriever who just discovered tennis balls existed. At 26, he had the kind of effortless confidence that comes from never having to fight for anything, never having to prove himself twice, never walking into a room wondering if his voice would be heard or dismissed. He wore his promotion like a new suit, clearly expensive but not quite fitted properly, the sleeves a little too long for someone still growing into the role. I watched him from my new desk, a smaller workspace tucked away from the main marketing floor, as he settled into what Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Used to be my office. The corner space with the city view, the whiteboard covered in campaign strategies I'd developed, the bookshelf lined with industry awards that bore my name but would now reflect his success. He'd already rearranged the furniture, replacing my family photos with his collection of craft beer bottles and a framed poster of some motivational quote about disruption and innovation. "Jessica," he called out, waving me over with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely believed this transition was going to be smooth and collegial. "I wanted to run through the TechFlow presentation with you. David said you had some background materials that might be helpful." Background materials. 7 months of relationship building, 3 major campaign pivots, and a client retention strategy that had increased their account value by 40%, reduced to background materials. I walked over with the smile I'd perfected during corporate presentations, the one that conveyed competence and cooperation while revealing absolutely nothing about what I was actually thinking. "Of course," I said, settling into the chair across from the desk that used to be mine. "The TechFlow account has some specific nuances you'll want to understand before the quarterly review next week." Tyler leaned back in my former chair, fingers laced behind his head in a pose that suggested he was ready to absorb wisdom from the departing mentor. He had no idea that Amanda Foster, TechFlow's CEO, had already sent me 3 text messages expressing concern about the sudden change in account management. He didn't know that she'd specifically requested a transition meeting with both of us present, or that she'd mentioned exploring other agency options if the quality of service declined. For the next hour, I walked Tyler through client preferences, campaign performance metrics, and relationship dynamics that I'd spent years cultivating. He took notes in a leather-bound journal, nodding thoughtfully at appropriate intervals, asking questions that revealed exactly how much he didn't understand about the complexity of what he'd inherited. "This is great stuff," he said when I finished, closing the journal with the satisfaction of someone who believed an hour briefing could replace months of experience. "I think I've got a good handle on it. Amanda seems pretty straightforward to work with." I almost laughed. Amanda Foster was many things. Brilliant, demanding, strategic, innovative, but straightforward wasn't one of them. She was the kind of client who could detect insincerity from 3 states away, who expected her agency partners to understand her business better than some of her own employees did. She'd eaten account managers for breakfast at 2 previous agencies before finding her way to Pinnacle, specifically requesting to work with me after seeing the Verde campaign I'd developed. "She appreciates thorough preparation," I said diplomatically, "and she values relationships. She's been with us for 2 years now, so there's a lot of trust built into that partnership." Tyler nodded confidently. "Trust, got it. I'm pretty good with people. This should be fine." Famous last words, I thought, but I simply smiled and wished him luck. Tyler Brooks was about to discover that confidence and competence weren't interchangeable currencies, and Amanda Foster was going to be his very expensive education. The rest of that week unfolded like watching a slow-motion car accident, where everyone could see the collision coming except the driver. Tyler scheduled a kickoff meeting with Amanda without reviewing the account history. He proposed campaign modifications that I'd already tested and discarded 6 months earlier. He used buzzwords like, quote, synergy and optimization in contexts that made it clear he didn't understand what either term actually meant. Amanda's messages to me shifted from concerned to frustrated to barely contained exasperation. "Jessica, I need to understand what's happening with our account management. The new guy seems nice enough, but he's suggesting strategies we tried last year that didn't work. Can we schedule a call?" I found myself in an impossible position, officially removed from client contact, but still receiving direct communications from someone who represented nearly 30% of my former team's revenue. David's restructuring had created exactly the kind of vacuum that destroys client relationships, but I was now powerless to prevent the damage. Meanwhile, my new role as strategic planning coordinator turned out to be exactly as meaningless as it sounded. David assigned me projects that felt like academic exercises, market research reports that no one would read, competitive analyses for industries we didn't serve. I spent my days creating documents that would live in shared folders, occasionally referenced but never implemented, the corporate equivalent of busy work designed to keep me occupied while the real decisions happened elsewhere. But here's what David couldn't have anticipated. Having my responsibilities stripped away gave me something I'd never had during my meteoric rise through Pinnacle's ranks: time. Uninterrupted, unmonitored time to focus on the consulting business I'd been building quietly for 3 years. My first official day in the new role, I used my lunch break to finalize a proposal for Verde Lifestyle, not for Pinnacle, but for my independent consulting practice. They'd reached out 2 weeks earlier, frustrated with their current agency's lack of innovation, and wondering if I might be available for a project-based partnership. The irony was delicious. Verde was considering leaving Pinnacle partly because they missed the strategic thinking I'd brought to their account, not knowing that I was now available to provide exactly that service through a different channel. The proposal I submitted wasn't just competitive, it was revolutionary. 3 years of side consulting had taught me to operate without the overhead and bureaucracy that weighed down traditional agencies. I could offer Verde the same strategic expertise they'd valued at Pinnacle, but with more flexibility, faster turnaround times, and a cost structure that made their previous agency fees look like highway robbery. Within 48 hours, they'd accepted the proposal and signed a 6-month contract worth more than my quarterly salary at Pinnacle. That same week, I had coffee with Dr. Rebecca Morrison, a pediatrician who'd been one of my earliest consulting clients. She was expanding her practice and needed help developing a digital marketing strategy for a new location. Over lattes at Grind Coffee on 6th Street, she mentioned that 3 of her colleagues were dealing with similar challenges, all of them frustrated with large agencies that treated medical practices like generic service businesses. "You should talk to them," Rebecca said, stirring honey into her coffee. "Honestly, the work you did for us was better than anything we got from that big firm downtown." more personal, more strategic. You actually understood our business. By the end of our conversation, I had contact information for 2 additional prospects and a referral to the Austin Medical Association's marketing committee. Rebecca's casual coffee date had just opened a potential market segment I'd never considered, one where my combination of strategic thinking and personal attention could command premium rates. The beautiful thing about consulting work is that it compounds exponentially. Happy clients become referral sources, successful projects become case studies, and reputation spreads through professional networks faster than gossip through high school hallways. Every satisfied customer becomes a sales representative for your services, often more effective than any marketing campaign you could design. 3 weeks into my demotion, I was fielding more consulting inquiries than I could handle while maintaining my diminished responsibilities at Pinnacle. The cognitive dissonance was surreal. Spending my days creating meaningless reports for David while my phone buzzed with messages from potential clients who actually valued my expertise. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I was sitting in my parked car outside the Austin Women's Health Center after a routine prenatal appointment, scrolling through emails on my phone, when I realized I was looking at more consulting opportunities than I could realistically manage part-time. A sustainable fashion startup wanted help launching their e-commerce platform. A local restaurant group needed assistance with their digital presence. 2 different tech companies had reached out about brand positioning projects. The demand for my services had reached a tipping point where I had to choose: continue treating consulting as a side hustle while enduring David's professional punishment, or commit fully to building something that could support my family independent of Pinnacle's increasingly toxic environment. I called Carlos from the parking lot. "How would you feel about me leaving Pinnacle?" I asked without preamble. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Carlos knew about the demotion, knew about my frustration with David's treatment, but we hadn't seriously discussed the possibility of me walking away from a steady 6-figure salary while pregnant with our first child. "What are you thinking?" he asked carefully. I explained the consulting demand, the referral networks I'd built, the contracts I'd already signed. I walked him through the financial projections, the timeline for building a sustainable client base, the advantages of controlling my own schedule as we prepared for parenthood. The consulting work is already generating almost as much monthly income as my reduced salary, I said. And the growth trajectory is incredible. I'm turning down projects because I don't have time, not because the demand isn't there. Carlos was quiet for another moment. What about health insurance? Benefits? The security of a regular paycheck? These were legitimate concerns. The practical considerations that make leaving corporate employment feel like jumping off a cliff without knowing if there's water below. But I'd been running financial models for weeks, calculating scenarios and contingencies with the same analytical rigor I'd applied to marketing campaigns. I've researched independent health insurance options. The premiums are higher but not prohibitively so. And honestly, the security of a regular paycheck feels pretty illusory when your boss can eliminate your job responsibilities because you got pregnant. The conversation lasted another 20 minutes, covering everything from startup costs to client retention strategies to worst-case scenario planning. By the end of it, Carlos was not just supportive, but excited about the possibility of me building something entirely my own. "You know what?" he said finally. "You've been talking about wanting more control over your career for years. Maybe David did you a favor by showing you exactly what corporate loyalty gets you." That evening, I sat at our kitchen table with a legal pad and started outlining what full-time independence would look like. Not just the financial aspects, but the operational requirements, the legal considerations, the strategic approach to scaling a one-person consulting practice into something sustainable and profitable. The first step was obvious. I needed to formalize my business structure. For 3 years, I'd been operating as a sole proprietor, filing Schedule C with my taxes, and keeping consulting income separate from my Pinnacle salary. But serious growth required serious business infrastructure. I spent the weekend researching LLC formation, business banking requirements, and professional liability insurance. I drafted a business plan that outlined services, target markets, pricing strategies, and growth projections. I created financial models that showed how quickly consulting income could replace and exceed my corporate salary. By Sunday evening, I had a roadmap for professional independence that felt both ambitious and achievable. More importantly, I had something David Thompson couldn't take away from me. A clear path forward that didn't depend on his approval, his perception of my value, or his willingness to acknowledge my contributions. Monday morning, I walked into Pinnacle with a secret that felt like armor. While David was busy explaining to upper management why the TechFlow account needed additional support, and Tyler was frantically preparing for a client meeting he wasn't qualified to handle, I was carrying the knowledge that my future was no longer tied to their decisions. The power shift was subtle but profound. David's attempts to marginalize me no longer felt threatening because I wasn't dependent on his recognition for my professional survival. Tyler's incompetence wasn't frustrating because I was no longer invested in his success or failure. The meaningless projects I'd been assigned became opportunities to refine strategies I could apply to my consulting clients. I was still physically present at Pinnacle, still fulfilling my contractual obligations, still maintaining professional courtesy with colleagues and clients. But mentally, emotionally, strategically, I'd already moved on. I was playing a completely different game, one where David Thompson was irrelevant and Tyler Brooks was someone else's problem. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly that game was about to change for everyone involved. Thursday afternoon, Amanda Foster called me directly, bypassing Tyler and David entirely. Her voice was tight with frustration when I answered the phone. "Jessica, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Is Pinnacle still the right agency for TechFlow?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was about to spread. Amanda wasn't just expressing dissatisfaction with Tyler's performance. She was questioning whether the entire relationship was worth maintaining. For a client who represented nearly $500,000 in annual revenue, that was the kind of question that could trigger panic attacks in account managers and sleepless nights for regional directors. "What specifically is concerning you?" I asked, knowing that my response could either diffuse the situation or accelerate TechFlow's departure. "The new account manager seems competent enough," Amanda said diplomatically, "but he doesn't understand our business the way you did. He's proposing strategies that don't align with our goals, asking questions that suggest he hasn't reviewed our history, missing context that was crucial to our previous successes." I found myself in an impossible ethical position. Amanda was asking for my honest assessment of Pinnacle's ability to serve her account, but I was still officially employed by Pinnacle, still bound by professional obligations, even though I'd been effectively pushed out of the relationship. "Tyler is still learning the account," I said carefully. "There's always an adjustment period when transitioning client relationships." "Jessica." Amanda's voice was kind but firm. "I've been through enough agency transitions to know the difference between an adjustment period and a fundamental mismatch. This feels like the latter." The silence stretched between us, pregnant with implications that could reshape the professional landscape for everyone involved. Amanda was giving me an opportunity to influence TechFlow's decision, to either support Tyler's continued involvement or validate her concerns about the transition. In that moment, I realized I was holding the kind of power that David had tried to strip away from me. Amanda trusted my judgment more than she trusted Pinnacle's organizational chart. My opinion could determine whether Tyler succeeded or failed, whether David's restructuring strategy proved successful or backfired spectacularly. "If you're considering other options," I said finally, "I think you should explore what's available in the market. You deserve an agency partner who understands your vision and can execute it effectively." It wasn't an explicit recommendation to leave Pinnacle, but it wasn't a ringing endorsement of staying either. Amanda was smart enough to read between the lines, and I was experienced enough to know that lukewarm support from a trusted advisor was often more damaging than outright criticism. "Thank you for being honest," Amanda said. "That tells me everything I need to know." After we hung up, I sat at my diminished desk, staring at the computer screen while processing the implications of what had just happened. In trying to eliminate my influence over client relationships, David had inadvertently created a situation where my influence became more powerful than ever. Clients who trusted me personally were now questioning their relationship with Pinnacle institutionally. The irony was almost poetic. David's discrimination hadn't just damaged my career. It had potentially destabilized the very accounts he'd been trying to protect from the inconvenience of my pregnancy. But the real revelation was yet to come, and it would arrive in the form of an email that would change everything I thought I knew about my situation at Pinnacle. The email arrived at 4:47 p.m. on a Thursday, nestled between a vendor invoice and a meeting request, but its contents would unravel everything David Thompson thought he knew about controlling narratives and managing outcomes. The sender was Jennifer Walsh from Walsh & Associates, the employment attorney I'd consulted 3 weeks earlier during what I'd told Carlos was a routine legal review of my consulting business structure. Jessica, per our discussion, I've completed the preliminary review of your employment situation. The documentation you provided paints a clear picture of discriminatory practices that violate both state and federal employment law. I'd like to schedule a follow-up meeting to discuss your options and timeline for potential action. The case you've presented has substantial merit. I read the email twice before the full implications settled in. Jennifer wasn't just confirming that David's treatment constituted illegal discrimination. She was suggesting that the evidence I'd gathered was strong enough to build a winnable case. The careful documentation I'd been maintaining, the timeline of events following my pregnancy announcement, the sudden restructuring of my responsibilities, it all added up to a pattern that employment law was specifically designed to address. But here's what made Jennifer's email truly powerful. I hadn't contacted her because I wanted to sue Pinnacle. I had reached out because I wanted to understand my legal position as I transitioned to independent consulting, to ensure that my client relationships and business development activities didn't violate any employment agreements or non-compete clauses. The discrimination case was almost incidental, a secondary concern that Jennifer had identified while reviewing my employment contract and separation timeline. She'd asked routine questions about the circumstances surrounding my role change, and my answers had apparently raised enough red flags to warrant a separate legal strategy. The irony was breathtaking. While I'd been focused on building my escape route through consulting work, I'd inadvertently assembled the foundation for holding Pinnacle accountable for David's discriminatory behavior. The power I thought I was gaining through independence was nothing compared to the leverage that employment law provided against companies stupid enough to discriminate against pregnant employees. I closed my laptop and walked to the bathroom, partly because the baby was pressing against my bladder with increasing frequency, but mostly because I needed a private moment to process what Jennifer's email meant for everyone involved. David Thompson had committed the kind of rookie management mistake that employment attorneys dream about, creating a clear timeline of adverse employment actions immediately following an employee's pregnancy disclosure. The legal case practically wrote itself. Exemplary performance reviews for 7 years, followed by sudden demotion within weeks of announcing pregnancy. Responsibilities transferred to a less qualified male colleague. Title change that eliminated client contact and advancement opportunities. All documented in emails, witnessed by colleagues, and supported by performance metrics that would make David's justifications look like the desperate rationalization they were. But the lawsuit was just one option, and not necessarily the most strategically valuable one. Jennifer's email had given me something more important than legal recourse. It had given me information that David didn't know I possessed. Knowledge about the strength of my position, the weakness of his, and the multiple pathways available for addressing the situation. That evening, I met Carlos at our favorite restaurant, a quiet place in the Clarksville neighborhood where we could talk without worrying about running into Pinnacle colleagues. I'd asked him to leave work early, saying I had something important to discuss about our future plans. Jennifer thinks we have a strong discrimination case, I said after we'd ordered, keeping my voice low despite the relative privacy of our corner booth. Carlos nearly choked on his water. A lawsuit? Against Pinnacle? Potentially. The timeline is pretty damning. Stellar performance reviews, then sudden demotion immediately after pregnancy announcement. David basically handed us a textbook example of pregnancy discrimination. Carlos leaned back in his chair, processing the implications. He'd been supportive of my consulting transition, but litigation was an entirely different category of confrontation. What would that look like? I mean, if you pursued it? I'd been thinking about exactly that question since reading Jennifer's email. Employment litigation wasn't just about financial compensation. It was about establishing precedent, holding companies accountable, and ensuring that other women didn't face the same discriminatory treatment. But it was also time-consuming, emotionally draining, and potentially damaging to professional relationships in Austin's relatively small marketing community. Jennifer says we could pursue several different remedies: reinstatement to my original position, back pay for the salary reduction, punitive damages, legal fees. But honestly, I don't want my old job back. Not after seeing how David operates when he thinks he has power over someone's career. Carlos nodded slowly. So what are you thinking? That was the question I'd been wrestling with all afternoon. The legal case gave me leverage, but leverage was only valuable if you used it strategically. I could file a lawsuit and spend the next year fighting Pinnacle in court, or I could use the threat of litigation to negotiate a separation that served my long-term interests. I'm thinking about a different approach, I said. What if I used the legal leverage to negotiate an exit package that accelerates my consulting transition, severance pay, health insurance continuation, and most importantly, release from any non-compete restrictions? The beauty of this strategy was that it aligned everyone's interests while avoiding the uncertainty and expense of litigation. Pinnacle would pay a premium to avoid the negative publicity and legal costs of a discrimination lawsuit. I would get financial support for my consulting business launch and freedom from contractual restrictions that could limit my client development. Plus, I added, David would have to live with knowing that his discrimination actually accelerated my independence rather than controlling it. Carlos smiled for the first time since I'd mentioned the lawsuit. So you're essentially making him pay for the privilege of getting rid of you? Exactly. And the best part is, he'll probably think he's getting a good deal. We spent the rest of dinner discussing the practical implications of negotiating a separation package, the timeline for establishing my consulting business as a full-time operation, and the financial planning required to support our growing family through the transition. By the time we left the restaurant, we had a framework for turning David's discrimination into the catalyst for my professional independence. The next morning, I called Jennifer to schedule a strategy meeting. But before I could implement any legal approach, the situation at Pinnacle took a turn that would accelerate everyone's timeline and eliminate several options from consideration. Tyler Brooks walked into the office Friday morning looking like someone who'd spent the night wrestling with demons and losing. His usual golden retriever enthusiasm had been replaced by the hollow-eyed anxiety of someone facing professional consequences for the first time in his charmed life. He avoided eye contact with everyone, went straight to his office, and closed the door with unusual force. By 9 a.m., the entire marketing floor was buzzing with speculation. Sarah Kim had overheard Tyler on a phone call that involved a lot of apologizing and desperate reassurances. Pat Chen had received a meeting request from David marked urgent and, quote, confidential. Most tellingly, Amanda Foster's assistant had called asking for David's direct number, bypassing the usual account management hierarchy entirely. I didn't have to wait long for clarification. At 10:15, David emerged from his office with the expression of someone who'd just received very bad news and was trying to figure out how to minimize the damage. He walked directly to Tyler's office, knocked once, and entered without waiting for permission. The conversation that followed was muffled by glass walls and closed doors, but body language told the story clearly enough. David gestured aggressively while Tyler sat slumped in his chair, occasionally nodding or shaking his head in response to questions that seemed to grow more pointed as the meeting progressed. At one point, Tyler pulled out his phone and showed David something that made the older man's face go pale. 20 minutes later, David emerged alone and headed straight for the executive conference room, phone already pressed to his ear. Tyler remained in his office, staring at his computer screen with the 1,000-yard stare of someone contemplating career mortality. Sarah Kim appeared at my workstation around 11 a.m., with information that connected all the dots I'd been tracking separately. TechFlow just fired us, she said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. Amanda Foster sent Tyler an email this morning terminating their contract effective immediately. No transition period, no explanation beyond, quote, strategic realignment. They're asking for all account materials to be transferred by end of business today. The magnitude of this development hit me like a physical force. TechFlow wasn't just any client. They represented nearly $500,000 in annual revenue and served as a flagship account that Pinnacle used to attract other technology clients. Losing them wouldn't just impact the marketing department's numbers. It would trigger questions from upper management about David's leadership and strategic decision-making. What happened? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Sarah glanced around again before leaning closer. Apparently, Tyler sent them a campaign proposal, that was basically identical to something they'd already tested and rejected. When Amanda questioned him about it, he got defensive and suggested that maybe they hadn't implemented it correctly the first time. I closed my eyes briefly, imagining that conversation. Amanda Foster was someone who could discuss marketing strategy at the graduate level, who understood her target demographics better than most market research firms, who had built a successful technology company from startup to IPO in under a decade. Suggesting that she'd failed to implement a strategy correctly was like telling Mozart he didn't understand music composition. There's more, Sarah continued. Amanda apparently asked Tyler about some campaign metrics from last quarter, and he couldn't answer basic questions about performance data. She realized he hadn't even reviewed the account history before taking over. The complete picture was worse than I'd imagined. Tyler hadn't just failed to maintain the relationship I'd built with Amanda. He'd actively demonstrated incompetence so profound that it insulted her intelligence and questioned her business judgment. For someone of Amanda's caliber, working with an account manager who didn't understand her business wasn't just ineffective. It was professionally insulting. "Is David panicking?" I asked. Sarah's expression answered before her words did. "He's been on the phone with upper management for the past hour. I heard him mention something about transition complications and temporary setbacks. But Jessica, Amanda didn't just fire us. She specifically requested that all future communications go through you, not Tyler or David." That detail changed everything. Amanda hadn't just terminated Pinnacle's services. She'd essentially requested that I personally handle the transition, despite my official removal from client responsibilities. She was treating me as the competent professional she'd always known, regardless of whatever organizational shuffling David had imposed. The request put me in an impossible position. Professionally, I was supposed to redirect Amanda to Tyler or David, acknowledging their authority over client relationships. Practically, I was the only person at Pinnacle who could manage the transition smoothly and maintain any possibility of future collaboration. Ethically, I had obligations to both my current employer and a client who had specifically requested my involvement. But there was another layer to consider. Amanda's request for my direct involvement in the transition created an opportunity to demonstrate exactly what Pinnacle was losing by sidelining me. If I handled the TechFlow separation professionally and efficiently, it would highlight the competence that David had chosen to waste. If the transition went poorly under Tyler's management, it would validate Amanda's decision to seek alternatives. I was contemplating these implications when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Amanda Foster's direct line. "Jessica, I hope you don't mind me calling directly," Amanda said when I answered. "I know there have been some organizational changes at Pinnacle, but I wanted to speak with you about the transition process." "Of course," I replied, keeping my voice neutral, despite the charged atmosphere around me. "I understand you've decided to explore other agency options." "That's right." The decision wasn't made lightly, but after working with your replacement for several weeks, it became clear that Pinnacle and TechFlow are no longer aligned strategically. I'm calling because I'd like you to personally handle the account transition, if that's possible within your current role. The request was both flattering and strategically significant. Amanda was essentially asking me to manage the professional divorce between her company and mine, trusting me to handle sensitive information and relationship dynamics that could impact both organizations' reputations. "I'd be happy to coordinate the transition," I said. "What timeline are you working with?" "We'd like to have all materials transferred and final billings reconciled by the end of next week. We've already identified a new agency partner and want to minimize any disruption to our Q2 campaigns." Amanda had already selected a replacement agency. This wasn't a negotiation or an opportunity for Pinnacle to win back the business. It was simply a matter of managing the logistics of separation. The speed of her decision suggested that Tyler's incompetence had been even more damaging than I'd realized. "That's an aggressive timeline, but definitely manageable," I said. "I'll put together a transition plan and coordinate with your team on the logistics." "Thank you, Jessica. I really appreciate your professionalism through all of this. I hope you know that our decision reflects no dissatisfaction with your work. Quite the opposite, actually." After we hung up, I sat quietly for a moment, processing the implications of what had just occurred. Amanda's final comment suggested that she understood the organizational dynamics behind my removal from her account, and that she viewed the transition as a loss of talent rather than an improvement in service. More importantly, her request for my direct involvement in the transition gave me unprecedented access to information about why clients chose to leave Pinnacle and where they were going instead. Understanding the competitive landscape from a client's perspective would be invaluable intelligence for my consulting business. I was drafting a transition plan when David appeared at my workstation, his usual confident demeanor replaced by barely controlled panic. "Jessica, I need your help with the TechFlow situation," he said, his voice tight with stress. "Amanda Foster specifically requested that you handle the transition, and frankly, we can't afford to have this go badly. There are already questions from upstairs about account retention in the marketing department." The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. 3 weeks earlier, David had decided that my pregnancy made me unsuitable for client management responsibilities. Now he was begging me to manage the most sensitive client relationship in the department because Tyler's incompetence had created a crisis that threatened his own position. "I'd be happy to help," I said, maintaining the professional courtesy that had served me well throughout my career. Amanda mentioned an end-of-week timeline for materials transfer. "I'll need access to all account files and billing records to coordinate effectively." David nodded eagerly. "Whatever you need, Tyler will provide full access to his files, and I'll make sure accounting prioritizes any billing reconciliation requests. I'll also need authority to communicate directly with Amanda's team without routing requests through Tyler," I added. "The transition will be more efficient if I can coordinate logistics directly with their project managers." "Absolutely. Consider yourself the primary point of contact for anything TechFlow related." David's eagerness to restore my client authority revealed exactly how precarious his position had become. Upper management had obviously asked pointed questions about losing a flagship account, and he needed to demonstrate that he could manage the crisis effectively. Putting me back in charge of the relationship was essentially an admission that removing me had been a mistake, though he'd never frame it that way publicly. "One more thing," I said, seizing the opportunity to extract maximum value from David's desperation. "I'd like to schedule a meeting with you early next week to discuss some strategic recommendations based on what I learned during the transition. Client feedback during separations can provide valuable insights for preventing future departures." David agreed immediately, unaware that he'd just given me permission to gather competitive intelligence that would inform my consulting business strategy. The transition process would give me direct access to Amanda's decision-making criteria, her new agency selection process, and her specific criticisms of Pinnacle's service delivery. More importantly, David's crisis had created an opportunity to demonstrate my value to the organization at the exact moment when I was preparing to leave it. The successful management of TechFlow's transition would serve as a professional calling card, proof that I could handle complex client relationships under pressure. But the real opportunity was still developing, and it would come in the form of a conversation that would reshape everything I thought I knew about my options and timeline. That afternoon, Amanda Foster called me back with a proposal that would change the entire trajectory of my career transition. Amanda Foster's second call came at exactly 3:30 p.m. during the brief lull between lunch meetings and afternoon conferences that Austin business culture had unofficially designated as strategic conversation time. I was reviewing the TechFlow transition documents when her name appeared on my phone screen, and something in the timing felt deliberately calculated rather than coincidental. "Jessica, I have an unconventional proposal," she said without preamble. "Before we finalize the agency transition, I'd like to explore whether there might be a different solution that serves everyone's interests better." The phrase unconventional proposal from someone like Amanda Foster wasn't casual conversation. It was the opening move in a negotiation that she'd probably been planning since Tyler's first incompetent presentation. Amanda didn't make impulsive business decisions, and she certainly didn't waste time on solutions that didn't advance her strategic objectives. "I'm listening," I said, closing the transition documents and giving her my complete attention. "TechFlow is growing faster than we anticipated. We're expanding into 3 new markets over the next 18 months, launching 2 product lines, and scaling our team from 60 to over 100 employees. We need marketing leadership that can grow with us, think strategically about brand positioning, and execute campaigns that support aggressive expansion goals." Amanda was describing exactly the kind of challenge that had drawn me to marketing in the first place. Complex, multifaceted growth initiatives that required both creative thinking and analytical precision. The scope she outlined was significantly more sophisticated than anything Tyler could handle, and probably beyond what most traditional agencies could deliver effectively. That sounds like an exciting challenge, I said. What kind of support structure are you considering? That's where the unconventional part comes in. Instead of hiring another agency, we're considering bringing marketing leadership in-house. We want someone who understands our business intimately, can make strategic decisions quickly, and has the experience to build marketing systems that scale with rapid growth. The implication was clear before she stated it explicitly. Amanda wasn't just describing TechFlow's marketing needs. She was describing a job opportunity that aligned perfectly with my skills, experience, and career objectives. She was offering me a way out of Pinnacle that didn't require building a consulting business from scratch or navigating the uncertainties of entrepreneurship while pregnant. We'd like to offer you the position of Director of Marketing Strategy, Amanda continued. Full-time, equity participation, comprehensive benefits, and most importantly, reporting directly to me rather than working through agency intermediaries. The offer hit me like lightning in the best possible way. Amanda was proposing to solve multiple problems simultaneously. TechFlow would get marketing leadership from someone who already understood their business. I would escape David's discriminatory environment with a significant career advancement. And Pinnacle would lose both a major client and a key employee as direct consequences of David's poor judgment. But the timing created complications that Amanda couldn't have anticipated. I was 5 months pregnant, approaching the point where disclosure would be unavoidable, and any job transition would require navigating pregnancy-related discussions with a new employer. The irony of potentially facing the same discrimination issues that had driven me away from Pinnacle wasn't lost on me. Amanda, I'm incredibly interested in the opportunity, I said carefully, but there are some personal circumstances that might affect the timeline and logistics of any transition. You mean your pregnancy? Amanda's response was so matter-of-fact that it took me a moment to process. Jessica, I've been a CEO long enough to notice when talented women start wearing looser clothing and drinking sparkling water at business dinners. Congratulations, by the way. The relief of not having to navigate disclosure anxiety was immediately replaced by curiosity about how Amanda viewed pregnancy in the context of executive hiring. Her tone suggested that my condition was a factor she'd already considered and incorporated into her decision-making process. I appreciate your directness, I said. How does that affect your timeline and expectations for the role? It doesn't. TechFlow has comprehensive parental leave policies, and frankly, we'd rather have you operating at 70% capacity than anyone else at full capacity. You'd be joining a company that actually believes work-life balance improves performance rather than threatening it. The contrast with David's approach couldn't have been more stark. Where he saw pregnancy as a liability that required damage control, Amanda viewed it as a normal life event that competent organizations accommodate without drama. Her attitude represented exactly the kind of leadership culture I wanted to be part of, regardless of whether I was expecting a child. What would the transition timeline look like? I asked. Ideally, we'd like you to start within the next month. That gives us time to establish strategic direction before your maternity leave, and allows you to build relationships with key team members who'll be executing campaigns while you're out. When you return, you'll have a foundation in place rather than starting from scratch. Amanda had clearly thought through the practical implications of hiring a pregnant executive, addressing concerns that David hadn't even bothered to consider before implementing his discriminatory restructuring. Her approach demonstrated exactly the kind of strategic thinking that made TechFlow successful and Pinnacle's loss of their account so damaging. I'd need to review the complete offer details and discuss timing with my husband, I said. But Amanda, I'm genuinely excited about the possibility of joining TechFlow's growth trajectory. Excellent. I'll have our HR team prepare a formal offer package that you can review over the weekend. Fair warning. We're prepared to be very competitive with compensation and equity participation. We don't want this to be a difficult financial decision. After we hung up, I sat in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. In the span of 30 minutes, Amanda Foster had transformed my professional situation, from managing the fallout of David's discrimination to contemplating a career opportunity that exceeded anything I'd imagined when I first started building my consulting practice. The job offer solved multiple strategic challenges simultaneously. I would escape Pinnacle's increasingly toxic environment with a significant advancement rather than a lateral move. The compensation would likely exceed what I could realistically earn through consulting during my first year of independent practice. Most importantly, I would be joining an organization where my pregnancy was viewed as a normal life event rather than a career liability. But Amanda's offer also created a new category of leverage in my relationship with Pinnacle. If I chose to accept TechFlow's position, I would be leaving to join their former client as a direct result of David's mismanagement. The optics would be devastating for both David's reputation and Pinnacle's client retention narrative. I called Carlos immediately. "TechFlow just offered me a job," I said when he answered. "What kind of job?" "Director of Marketing Strategy. Reporting directly to Amanda Foster. Full-time, equity participation, and she already knows about the pregnancy." Carlos was quiet for a long moment. "That's incredible. But Jessica, what about the consulting business? What about building something of your own?" These were fair questions that had been running through my mind since Amanda's call. The consulting work had been my plan for independence, my strategy for escaping corporate employment entirely. Amanda's offer represented a different kind of independence. Joining a growth stage company where I could shape marketing strategy without the bureaucratic constraints that had made Pinnacle increasingly frustrating. The consulting business was a reaction to feeling trapped at Pinnacle, I said. But this opportunity is proactive rather than reactive. I'd be joining a company that values strategic thinking, treats pregnancy as normal, and offers equity participation in what could be significant growth. Carlos and I spent an hour discussing the practical implications, financial projections, and long-term strategic value of each option. The consulting path offered maximum independence, but required building everything from scratch while managing new parenthood. The TechFlow opportunity provided immediate advancement with comprehensive support systems, but meant remaining in corporate employment rather than achieving complete entrepreneurial independence. "What does your gut tell you?" Carlos asked finally. "That Amanda Foster is the kind of leader I want to work for, and TechFlow is the kind of company I want to help build." The consulting work taught me that I enjoy strategic challenges, but I don't necessarily need to be my own boss to have the kind of career I want. That evening, I drove to Jennifer Walsh's office for our scheduled legal consultation, but my agenda had shifted dramatically since making the appointment. Instead of discussing litigation strategy or negotiated separation packages, I wanted to understand how a job offer from Pinnacle's former client might affect my legal position and professional obligations. Jennifer's office occupied the 15th floor of a downtown building with views of Lady Bird Lake, decorated with law degrees, professional awards, and photographs that suggested she'd built a successful practice representing employees in disputes with large corporations. She reviewed the notes from our previous conversation before addressing the changed circumstances. "A job offer from TechFlow is an interesting development," she said, after I explained Amanda's proposal. "It potentially strengthens your discrimination case while providing a practical remedy that might be more valuable than monetary damages." Jennifer explained that employment law recognized constructive discharge, situations where discriminatory treatment created working conditions so intolerable that reasonable employees would feel compelled to resign. If I accepted TechFlow's offer and left Pinnacle, it could be framed as David's discrimination forcing me out of my job, making the damages calculation more straightforward. "But here's what's really compelling about your situation," Jennifer continued. "You're not just leaving for any opportunity. You're joining Pinnacle's former client as a direct result of the relationship you built before being demoted. That creates a narrative about lost business value that goes beyond individual discrimination." The legal analysis revealed layers of accountability that I hadn't fully considered. David's discrimination hadn't just damaged my career. It had created conditions that led to Pinnacle losing a major client and a key employee to that same client. The financial impact extended far beyond my individual's salary and benefits. "What would you recommend as next steps?" I asked. "Accept the TechFlow offer if it aligns with your career goals," Jennifer said without hesitation. "Document everything about your departure from Pinnacle, including any exit interview comments or transition requests. We can always pursue legal remedies later if necessary, but right now you have leverage that money can't buy. Jennifer was right about leverage. Amanda's job offer had transformed my relationship with David from victim of discrimination to professional competitor for talent and market position. Instead of fighting for recognition within Pinnacle's hierarchy, I could demonstrate my value by succeeding in a more senior role at a company that actually appreciated strategic thinking. Friday morning, I walked into Pinnacle with Amanda's formal offer package in my briefcase and a clear strategy for managing the next phase of my career transition. The offer exceeded my expectations in every category: base salary, equity participation, benefits, and most importantly, reporting structure that would give me real authority over strategic decisions. David was in crisis management mode, fielding calls from upper management about the TechFlow departure and preparing explanations that wouldn't reflect poorly on his leadership. Tyler had taken a sick day, apparently unable to face the office environment where his incompetence had become the subject of departmental gossip. I spent the morning finalizing TechFlow's transition materials, ensuring that all account documentation was organized and accessible for whatever agency they'd selected as Pinnacle's replacement. The professional courtesy felt both appropriate and strategic. Amanda would remember how smoothly I'd managed the separation, reinforcing her confidence in my executive capabilities. At 11 a.m., I knocked on David's office door. "Jessica, please, sit down," he said, gesturing toward the chairs across from his desk. "I wanted to thank you for how you've handled the TechFlow situation. Your professionalism during a difficult transition has been exactly what we needed." David's gratitude felt hollow given that the transition had only been necessary because of his discriminatory management decisions, but I accepted his comments with appropriate grace. More importantly, his appreciation provided the perfect opening for the conversation I'd come to have. "I'm glad I could help stabilize the situation," I said. "Actually, that's why I wanted to meet with you. The TechFlow transition has given me some perspective on my career trajectory and future goals." David leaned forward slightly, probably expecting me to request restoration to my previous role or acknowledgement of my value to the organization. His expression suggested he was prepared to offer modest concessions in exchange for my continued loyalty and institutional knowledge. "I've received an offer from TechFlow to join their executive team as Director of Marketing Strategy," I said simply. "I wanted to give you advance notice that I'll be accepting the position and submitting my resignation next week." The color drained from David's face as he processed the implications of what I'd just said. Not only was I leaving Pinnacle, but I was joining the client whose departure had already created significant problems for his performance review. The optics were catastrophic. A key employee following a major client out the door as a direct result of internal management decisions. "Jessica, let's talk about this," David said, his voice taking on the desperate tone of someone trying to prevent a disaster. "I know the restructuring has been an adjustment, but we can discuss modifications to your role that address your concerns." The offer to negotiate came several months too late, and for entirely the wrong reasons. David wasn't recognizing my value because he'd gained new appreciation for my contributions. He was panicking because losing me to TechFlow would create a narrative about his leadership that upper management couldn't ignore. "I appreciate the willingness to discuss adjustments," I said diplomatically. "But TechFlow's offer represents exactly the kind of strategic challenge and growth opportunity I'm looking for at this stage of my career." David spent the next 20 minutes trying to construct a counteroffer that might compete with TechFlow's package, but his proposals revealed exactly why I was eager to leave. He offered title changes without authority, salary increases without equity participation, and expanded responsibilities without corresponding decision-making power. Everything about his approach demonstrated the hierarchical thinking that had made my pregnancy seem like a management problem rather than a normal life event. "David, I've made my decision," I said finally. "TechFlow's offer aligns with my long-term career goals in ways that go beyond compensation. I'm excited about the opportunity to build marketing strategy for a growth stage company." After leaving David's office, I walked back to my workstation with the satisfaction of someone who'd just executed a perfect strategic maneuver. David's panic confirmed that my departure would create exactly the kind of professional consequences that his discrimination had earned. More importantly, my transition to TechFlow would demonstrate that pregnancy hadn't derailed my career. It had simply motivated me to pursue opportunities with leaders smart enough to value talent regardless of personal circumstances. Pat Chen stopped by my desk around 2 p.m., ostensibly to ask about the TechFlow transition, but clearly fishing for information about the rumors that were already circulating through the office. "I heard David looked pretty shaken after your meeting," she said quietly. "Everything okay?" Pat had been a mentor and ally throughout my time at Pinnacle, someone who'd recognized my potential before I'd proven it, and supported my advancement, even when it meant challenging David's preferences. She deserved to hear about my decision directly, rather than through office gossip. "I'm leaving to join TechFlow's executive team," I said. "Director of Marketing Strategy, reporting directly to Amanda Foster." Pat's reaction was immediate and enthusiastic. "Jessica, that's fantastic. Amanda Foster is brilliant, and TechFlow is exactly the kind of company where you can make a real impact. Congratulations." Her excitement reinforced my confidence in the decision. Pat understood the corporate landscape well enough to recognize that TechFlow's offer represented genuine career advancement rather than just an escape from Pinnacle's problems. "I'm sorry to see you go, but I'm thrilled about the opportunity," Pat continued. "And between you and me, David's management of your situation has been a masterclass in how not to handle talent retention." Pat's comment suggested that David's discrimination hadn't gone unnoticed by other senior leaders, and that my departure would likely prompt questions about his decision-making process. The accountability I'd hoped to achieve through legal channels was happening naturally through professional consequences. Monday morning, I submitted my formal resignation letter to David and HR, officially ending my 7-year tenure at Pinnacle Marketing Solutions. The letter was professional and gracious, thanking the company for development opportunities, while noting my excitement about joining TechFlow's growth trajectory. David's response was a masterpiece of corporate cognitive dissonance, simultaneously expressing regret about my departure while implying that my decision reflected external opportunities rather than internal management failures. His email to the department announcing my resignation carefully avoided mentioning that I was joining TechFlow, as if omitting that detail might minimize the implied criticism of his leadership, but the marketing team wasn't fooled by David's spin. Sarah Kim, who'd watched the entire situation unfold from her front row seat as my assistant, sent me a private message that captured the prevailing sentiment. "Everyone knows David screwed up by demoting you. Watching you land at TechFlow is the most satisfying plot twist ever." 2 weeks later, I walked into TechFlow's offices in the Domain, Austin's bustling business district, as their new director of marketing strategy. The contrast with Pinnacle's environment was immediately apparent. Open collaboration spaces designed for strategic thinking, conference rooms named after Austin landmarks rather than corporate buzzwords, and a leadership team that included several women in senior positions. Amanda Foster met me at reception, personally handling my first day orientation in a way that demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership culture I'd hoped to join. Her approach to onboarding was strategic rather than bureaucratic, focused on understanding my perspective on TechFlow's market position and growth opportunities rather than simply processing paperwork. "Jessica, I want you to know that your pregnancy played zero role in our hiring timeline," Amanda said during our initial strategy session. "We're building a company that supports the whole person, not just the professional persona. Your maternity leave is an investment in retaining talent, not a cost to be minimized." Amanda's attitude represented everything that David's approach had lacked. Recognition that supporting employees through major life events actually strengthens organizations rather than weakening them. Her leadership philosophy created exactly the kind of environment where strategic thinking could flourish without bureaucratic interference. Within my first month at TechFlow, I developed a comprehensive marketing strategy for their expansion into 3 new markets, established relationships with key team members who would execute campaigns during my upcoming maternity leave, and participated in strategic planning sessions that would have been impossible at Pinnacle's hierarchical structure. Most satisfying, I learned through Austin's interconnected business community that Pinnacle had lost 2 additional clients in the months following my departure, both citing concerns about account management consistency and strategic direction. David's discrimination hadn't just cost him 1 employee and 1 client. It had triggered a pattern of departures that threatened the entire department's stability. Tyler Brooks, meanwhile, had resigned from Pinnacle and moved back to Dallas, apparently deciding that Austin's competitive marketing environment didn't align with his professional capabilities. His departure eliminated the last visible reminder of David's discriminatory decision-making, but the damage to department morale and client confidence had already been done. 6 months after joining TechFlow, I gave birth to Sophia Martinez, a healthy baby girl who arrived exactly 2 weeks before Amanda's aggressive Q3 campaign launch timeline. The fact that I'd planned and coordinated strategic initiatives that would execute smoothly during my absence demonstrated exactly the kind of strategic thinking that David had dismissed as incompatible with motherhood. Amanda sent flowers to the hospital with a note that read, "Congratulations on your newest strategic initiative. TechFlow will be here when you're ready to return to your other strategic initiatives." During my 12 weeks of maternity leave, TechFlow's marketing team executed campaigns that exceeded performance targets by 30%, launched the new product lines I'd helped position, and established market presence in all 3 expansion territories. The success validated everything I'd argued about the possibility of building systems that function effectively regardless of individual availability. When I returned to work, Amanda had already approved budget increases for the marketing department, expanded my team by 4 additional specialists, and scheduled strategic planning sessions for TechFlow's next phase of growth. My maternity leave hadn't derailed my career trajectory. It had provided time for the company to recognize the value of the foundation I'd established. A year after leaving Pinnacle, I received a LinkedIn message from Pat Chen with news that completed the circle of accountability I'd hoped to achieve. David Thompson had been transitioned to an advisory role following a comprehensive review of the marketing department's client retention and personnel management practices. Pat's message noted that upper management had specifically cited the loss of both TechFlow's account and my employment as evidence of strategic leadership failures. The final vindication came in the form of TechFlow's acquisition offer 18 months later. Amanda's growth strategy had succeeded beyond even her ambitious projections, attracting acquisition interest from several larger technology companies. As Director of Marketing Strategy with equity participation, I stood to benefit significantly from any sale, transforming David's discrimination into the foundation of genuine financial independence. But the real satisfaction wasn't financial, it was professional. I'd built something meaningful at TechFlow, contributed to genuine strategic success, and demonstrated that pregnancy was entirely compatible with executive leadership when organizations possessed the wisdom to support, rather than discriminate, against talented women. David Thompson's attempt to control my career through discriminatory management had actually accelerated my advancement beyond anything I could have achieved within Pinnacle's hierarchical structure. His prejudice had forced me to pursue opportunities with leaders smart enough to recognize talent regardless of personal circumstances. Sometimes the best revenge isn't plotting someone's downfall. It's succeeding so spectacularly that their discrimination becomes the catalyst for achievements they never imagined possible. David thought pregnancy would derail my ambitions, but it actually motivated me to pursue opportunities with leaders who understood that supporting the whole person creates stronger organizations. I didn't just escape David's discrimination. I transformed it into the foundation of a career that exceeded every goal I'd set when I first walked into Pinnacle 7 years earlier. And the beautiful irony is that his attempt to diminish my value actually forced me to discover capabilities I never knew I possessed. Sophia is 3 years old now, and she loves coming to TechFlow's family-friendly offices, where Amanda keeps a toy box in her conference room, and the leadership team discusses quarterly strategies while children play nearby. It's exactly the kind of environment where both professional excellence and personal fulfillment can thrive simultaneously. David Thompson taught me that some people will always view pregnancy as a professional liability. Amanda Foster taught me that the right leaders see it as proof that you can manage complex, long-term projects with strategic thinking and grace under pressure. I chose to work for people who understand that motherhood isn't a career limitation. It's additional evidence of exactly the kind of executive capabilities that drive organizational success. 5 years after walking away from Pinnacle Marketing Solutions, I found myself standing in the boardroom of TechFlow Industries, now officially TechFlow Corporation, following our acquisition by Meridian Technologies, addressing a room full of executives who'd flown in from Silicon Valley to understand how a mid-market Austin company had achieved the kind of growth metrics that commanded a 9-figure acquisition price. Sophia sat quietly in the corner, coloring in a workbook while occasionally glancing up at the presentation screens that displayed marketing performance data spanning the years since I joined Amanda's team. At 8 years old, she was already accustomed to accompanying me to strategic meetings, having grown up in an environment where motherhood and executive leadership coexisted seamlessly, rather than competing for priority. The key to sustainable growth wasn't just identifying market opportunities, I explained to the Meridian team, clicking through slides that showed TechFlow's expansion from a 60-person startup to a 300-employee acquisition target. It was building systems that could scale with rapid expansion while maintaining the strategic flexibility to adapt to changing market conditions. The presentation represented more than quarterly performance metrics. It was a comprehensive case study in what becomes possible when organizations support talent rather than discriminating against it. Every growth milestone, every successful campaign launch, every strategic pivot that had contributed to TechFlow's acquisition value could be traced back to the foundation I'd built during those early months when Amanda had chosen to invest in my capabilities rather than viewing my pregnancy as a limitation. Marcus Webb, Meridian's chief operating officer, leaned forward during the Q&A session with the kind of focused attention that suggested he was evaluating acquisition assets rather than simply reviewing historical performance. Jessica, walk us through the decision-making process that led to the Southeast expansion. That market entry strategy became the template for your subsequent growth initiatives. The Southeast expansion had been my first major strategic recommendation after returning from maternity leave. A calculated risk that required convincing Amanda to invest significant capital in markets where TechFlow had no existing presence. The success of that initiative had established my reputation within the company and validated Amanda's faith in my strategic thinking capabilities. The Southeast represented an underserved market with demographics that aligned perfectly with our user base. I began, pulling up regional analysis data that I'd compiled during late-night research sessions while Sophia slept. But the real opportunity was timing. Our competitors were focused on coastal markets, leaving mid-tier cities with growing tech sectors largely ignored. The expansion had required 18 months of careful planning, relationship building, and resource allocation across multiple states. We'd established partnerships with local technology incubators, hired regional marketing specialists, and developed campaigns that resonated with Southern business culture while maintaining TechFlow's innovative brand identity. The results exceeded projections by 40% in the first year, I continued, displaying performance charts that showed consistent growth across all Southeast markets. More importantly, the expansion model we developed became the framework for entering the Pacific Northwest and Mountain West regions. What I didn't mention during the presentation was that the Southeast strategy had been conceived during my maternity leave, developed through research I'd conducted while nursing Sophia during those quiet 3 a.m. feeding sessions. The geographical analysis, competitive landscape assessment, and market entry timeline had all been refined during the supposedly unproductive months when David Thompson would have assumed I was focused entirely on motherhood. The irony wasn't lost on me that some of my most strategic thinking had occurred during the period when traditional corporate culture would have written me off as temporarily unavailable for serious business considerations. Amanda's support for maintaining my involvement in strategic planning throughout my leave had created exactly the kind of continuity that made ambitious initiatives possible. After the Meridian team left, Amanda and I sat in her office reviewing the final acquisition documents that would officially transfer TechFlow's ownership while maintaining our operational independence. The financial terms were generous enough to provide genuine wealth for all equity holders, but the strategic partnership offered something even more valuable: resources to scale our successful model across Meridian's existing portfolio companies. Jessica, I want you to know that your equity payout represents more than financial compensation, Amanda said, signing the final authorization forms. It's recognition that your strategic contributions were fundamental to everything we achieved here. The equity calculation had been substantial enough to provide complete financial security for Sophia's education, our family's future, and the kind of independence that makes career decisions entirely voluntary rather than economically necessary. But Amanda was right about the deeper significance. The financial reward represented validation that pregnancy had enhanced rather than diminished my professional value. I have a proposition for you, Amanda continued. Meridian wants to implement TechFlow's growth model across their portfolio companies. They're offering to create a new position, Director of Strategic Expansion, reporting directly to their executive team. You'd be responsible for developing marketing strategies for 12 different companies across various industries. The opportunity Amanda described was exactly the kind of challenge that would have seemed impossible during my Pinnacle days, when David's discrimination had made me question whether pregnancy was compatible with career advancement. Meridian's offer represented recognition that my strategic thinking capabilities had been proven at the highest levels of corporate performance. The role would be based here in Austin, but with travel to portfolio companies as needed, Amanda added. Meridian specifically requested you because they want to replicate the strategic approach that made TechFlow successful. The proposal offered unprecedented professional scope while maintaining the work-life integration that had made my success at TechFlow sustainable. More importantly, it represented the kind of executive opportunity that would have been unthinkable at Pinnacle, where David's narrow thinking had viewed pregnancy as evidence of diminished commitment rather than proof of strategic planning capabilities. I'm interested, I said, but I'd want to ensure that the travel requirements accommodate Sophia's schedule and that remote work flexibility is built into the role structure. Amanda smiled. Jessica, you've just demonstrated exactly the kind of strategic thinking that makes you perfect for this position. Meridian understands that supporting the whole person creates better business outcomes. They're not offering you this role despite your family commitments. They're offering it because your ability to manage complex priorities has been proven at the highest levels. That evening, I met Carlos at our favorite restaurant in Clarksville, the same place where we'd discussed my consulting business plans 5 years earlier, when David's discrimination had first forced me to consider alternatives to traditional corporate employment. The conversation had come full circle, but from a position of strength, rather than defensive reaction. Meridian's offer represents everything we hoped would be possible when we first talked about leaving Pinnacle, Carlos said, reviewing the compensation package and role description. You're not just escaping discrimination. You're being recruited for executive leadership based on proven strategic success. The contrast with my situation 5 years earlier was almost surreal. Instead of building consulting business from scratch while managing pregnancy and discrimination, I was being offered a senior executive position with a major corporation, specifically because of my track record of strategic achievement during the period when David had viewed my pregnancy as a professional liability. Sophia's reaction was interesting, I said, recalling our conversation earlier that evening, when I'd explained that Mommy might be changing jobs to help other companies grow the way TechFlow had grown. She asked if the new job would still let her come to the office sometimes. Carlos laughed. That's probably the most important performance metric for any role you consider. Sophia's comfort level with your work environment has been the foundation of everything else working. He was right about priorities. The success I'd achieved at TechFlow hadn't required sacrificing family time or creating artificial boundaries between motherhood and executive responsibilities. Sophia had grown up understanding that strategic thinking and nurturing weren't competing demands but complementary capabilities that reinforced each other. There's something else, I said, pulling out a letter that had arrived that morning. Jennifer Walsh forwarded me a message from someone at Pinnacle. Apparently, they're facing a class action lawsuit related to pregnancy discrimination practices. The letter was from a current Pinnacle employee who'd experienced treatment similar to what I'd endured under David's management. She'd contacted Jennifer seeking legal representation and had specifically mentioned my case as precedent for the pattern of discriminatory behavior that apparently continued after my departure. Jennifer thinks my documentation and timeline could be valuable evidence for establishing a pattern of institutional discrimination, I continued. She's asking whether I'd be willing to participate in the broader legal action. The irony was perfect. David's discrimination against me had not only accelerated my career advancement, but had also created legal precedent that could hold Pinnacle accountable for systemic discriminatory practices. His attempt to minimize my influence had actually amplified it beyond anything I could have achieved through traditional corporate channels. What are you thinking? Carlos asked. That David Thompson's discrimination created consequences he never anticipated, I said. Not just for my career, but for Pinnacle's legal liability and reputation in Austin's business community. The following week, I met with Jennifer Walsh to discuss participating in the expanded legal action against Pinnacle. Her office had acquired additional clients who'd experienced similar discriminatory treatment, and she'd built a comprehensive case that demonstrated institutional patterns rather than isolated incidents. Jessica, your case was the foundation that made the others possible, Jennifer explained, reviewing files that documented multiple instances of pregnancy-related discrimination at Pinnacle. Your thorough documentation and professional success afterward created the template for holding them accountable. Jennifer's analysis revealed that David's treatment of me hadn't been an isolated mistake, but part of a broader pattern of discriminatory management that had affected multiple employees. The legal action would seek both financial damages and institutional reforms that would prevent future discrimination. The interesting aspect of your situation is that you've already achieved better outcomes than any court settlement could provide, Jennifer continued. Your career advancement and financial success demonstrate that his discrimination accelerated rather than limited your professional development. The legal proceedings would take months to resolve, but my participation had already achieved something more valuable than monetary compensation: accountability for discriminatory practices that had affected multiple families and careers. David's attempt to control my career had created the foundation for systemic change that would protect future employees from similar treatment. 6 months later, I accepted Meridian's offer to become their Director of Strategic Expansion, with Sophia's enthusiastic approval and Amanda's recommendation serving as the foundation for my transition to enterprise-level strategic leadership. The role provided exactly the kind of challenge that David's discrimination had been designed to prevent me from pursuing. My first assignment involved developing marketing strategies for a biotechnology company in Denver, a financial services firm in Nashville, and a software startup in Portland. The diversity of industries and markets required exactly the kind of strategic thinking that had made TechFlow successful, but at a scale that would have been impossible without the foundation I'd built through Amanda's support. The Denver project was particularly satisfying because it involved helping a company navigate rapid growth while maintaining operational stability, the same challenge that TechFlow had faced during the period when David would have assumed I was unavailable for strategic thinking. The biotechnology firm's leadership team included 3 women in senior positions, all of whom had successfully integrated motherhood with executive responsibilities. We specifically requested you for this engagement because your track record demonstrates exactly the kind of strategic thinking we need during expansion phases, explained Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the biotech company's CEO, during our initial strategy session. Your ability to develop scalable systems while maintaining strategic flexibility is exactly what we're looking for. Dr. Mitchell's recognition represented everything that David's discrimination had been designed to prevent. Acknowledgement that my strategic capabilities had been enhanced rather than diminished by the experience of managing complex long-term projects like pregnancy and motherhood. The Portland software startup presented different challenges but similar opportunities to apply strategic thinking at enterprise scale. Their leadership team was younger and more diverse than traditional technology companies, with several executives who'd built successful careers while maintaining active family lives. Jessica, your approach to sustainable growth strategies aligns perfectly with our company culture, said Michael Chen, the startup's founder, during our planning sessions. We want to build something that supports the whole person, not just the professional persona. Michael's philosophy represented exactly the kind of leadership culture that had made my success at TechFlow possible. His commitment to supporting employee development regardless of personal circumstances created the foundation for the strategic thinking that drives genuine innovation. Within my first year at Meridian, the 3 portfolio companies I'd worked with achieved growth metrics that exceeded projections by an average of 35%. The success validated both my strategic approach and Meridian's decision to invest in executive leadership that understood the relationship between supporting employees and achieving business objectives. More importantly, the role provided opportunities to mentor other women who were navigating the intersection of career advancement and family planning. Several portfolio company employees had reached out seeking advice about managing pregnancy disclosure, maternity leave planning, and post-return career development. Jessica, I wanted to thank you for the conversation we had about strategic career planning, wrote Lisa Rodriguez, a marketing manager at the Nashville financial services firm. Your perspective on viewing pregnancy as a strategic planning exercise rather than a career interruption completely changed how I approached my own timeline. Lisa's message represented the kind of impact that extended beyond individual career success to systemic change in how organizations approach talent development. Her confidence in managing career advancement while planning for motherhood demonstrated that David's discriminatory assumptions were not only wrong, but counterproductive for organizational success. The broader implications became clear during a Meridian leadership retreat, where I presented case studies from my portfolio company work. The executive team included several women who'd built successful careers while raising families, and our discussions revealed that supporting employee development through major life transitions actually strengthened rather than weakened organizational performance. Jessica's results demonstrate that strategic thinking capabilities are enhanced rather than diminished by the experience of managing complex long-term projects, observed Patricia Williams, Meridian's chief executive officer, during the retreat's strategic planning session. Her approach to sustainable growth creates value that extends far beyond quarterly performance metrics. Patricia's analysis represented validation at the highest levels of corporate leadership for everything that David's discrimination had been designed to deny. Her recognition that strategic thinking capabilities were enhanced by life experience rather than threatened by it demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership philosophy that creates sustainable organizational success. 2 years after joining Meridian, I received an unexpected phone call from Pat Chen, my former mentor at Pinnacle. She'd left the company 6 months earlier to join a consulting firm specializing in organizational development and diversity strategy. Jessica, I wanted to let you know that Pinnacle has engaged our firm to conduct a comprehensive review of their talent management practices, Pat said. Your case came up repeatedly during our assessment as an example of how discriminatory management creates both legal liability and competitive disadvantage. Pat's consulting firm had been hired to address the systemic issues that had led to multiple discrimination lawsuits and significant talent retention problems. The irony was perfect. Pinnacle was now paying consultants to fix problems that had been created by David's discriminatory management of my career. We're recommending policy changes that would prevent the kind of treatment you experienced, Pat continued. But honestly, the damage to their reputation in Austin's business community has already been done. Several clients have mentioned your situation when explaining why they chose other agencies. The long-term consequences of David's discrimination had extended far beyond my individual career to affect Pinnacle's competitive position and market reputation. His attempt to control my career had created exactly the kind of systemic damage that smart organizations spend decades avoiding. There's one more thing, Pat added. David Thompson is no longer with the company. He was terminated as part of the management restructuring that followed the discrimination lawsuits. The news provided closure rather than satisfaction. David's termination represented accountability for discriminatory practices that had affected multiple employees and damaged Pinnacle's organizational culture. His discrimination had ultimately destroyed his own career while accelerating mine. That evening, I sat with Sophia in our backyard, watching her practice soccer skills while I reviewed strategic planning documents for my next Meridian assignment. At 11 years old, she was already demonstrating the kind of strategic thinking and goal-oriented planning that would serve her well regardless of what career path she chose. Mommy, why do you work with so many different companies? Sophia asked during a break from her practice routine. Because each company has different challenges that require different solutions, I explained. I help them figure out how to grow in ways that work for their specific situation. Sophia nodded thoughtfully. Like how you helped TechFlow grow, but now you help lots of companies grow. Exactly. And the interesting thing is that all the skills I use to help companies grow are the same skills I use to help our family grow and succeed. Sophia's understanding represented everything that David's discrimination had been designed to deny. Recognition that strategic thinking capabilities applied across all areas of life, from corporate planning to family development to personal growth. Her comfort with my career achievements demonstrated that motherhood and executive leadership were not competing demands, but complementary capabilities. Will you teach me how to do strategic planning? Sophia asked. I'm already teaching you, I said. Every time you set goals for school or soccer or art projects, you're doing strategic planning. The skills are the same, whether you're planning for a test or planning for a company's growth. The conversation represented everything I'd hoped to achieve when I first decided to leave Pinnacle's discriminatory environment. Sophia was growing up understanding that strategic thinking and nurturing were not competing priorities, but reinforcing capabilities that created value in all areas of life. As I watched Sophia return to her soccer practice, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from David's discriminatory management to executive leadership at one of the most successful acquisition firms in Austin. The career advancement I'd achieved hadn't required sacrificing family priorities or creating artificial boundaries between professional and personal success. Instead, David's discrimination had forced me to discover that strategic thinking capabilities were enhanced, rather than diminished, by the experience of managing complex, long-term projects like pregnancy, motherhood, and career development. His attempt to limit my influence had actually amplified it beyond anything I could have achieved through traditional corporate channels. The most satisfying aspect wasn't the financial success or professional recognition, though both had exceeded anything I'd imagined during my Pinnacle days. The real victory was creating a model for career advancement that supported the whole person, rather than requiring artificial choices between professional achievement and family priorities. Sophia's generation would grow up understanding that strategic thinking capabilities apply across all areas of life, from corporate planning to family development to personal growth. She would never have to choose between career advancement and motherhood, because she would see them as complementary capabilities that reinforce each other. That understanding represented the ultimate accountability for David Thompson's discriminatory assumptions. His attempt to control my career had created the foundation for systemic change that would benefit multiple generations of women who refused to accept artificial limitations on their professional potential. Sometimes the most powerful response to discrimination isn't legal action or direct confrontation, but strategic success that demonstrates exactly what discriminatory thinking costs organizations and individuals. David's discrimination had accelerated rather than limited my professional development, creating consequences he never anticipated and success he never imagined possible. The sunset painted the Austin skyline in shades of gold and amber as Sophia finished her practice and joined me on the porch, both of us satisfied with the day's accomplishments. Tomorrow would bring new strategic challenges, new opportunities to create value, and new chances to demonstrate that supporting the whole person creates better outcomes for everyone involved. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.